You should be thanking me for letting you leave with your dignity. Daniel Whitmore said it with a smile, as if he had just delivered a kindness instead of an insult. The entire conference room went silent. Victoria Brooks stood across from the man she had spent 12 years building a life with, listening to the person she once called her husband reduce her entire existence to a favor. She looked around the room. The executives who once asked for her opinion now avoided her eyes. The employees who knew her work now watched her like she was already a stranger. And Daniel, standing at the head of the table in his expensive suit, truly believed he had won. Victoria slowly picked up the small box sitting beside her laptop. Inside were a few personal items. A framed photo. A notebook filled with years of ideas. A simple coffee mug she had kept in her office since the company was only 3 people in a rented workspace. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Come on, Victoria. Don't make this dramatic. We both know this company grew because of my leadership. She looked at him for a moment, not with anger, but with something that unsettled him more. Calm. Your leadership? She asked quietly. Daniel smiled. Yes. The investors know my name. The market knows my name. Nobody built a billion-dollar company because of a woman working behind the scenes. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anyone expected. Victoria felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the same feeling she had carried for years. Not anger, not sadness, something deeper. The feeling of finally seeing someone exactly as they were. She remembered the nights she stayed awake fixing problems before major launches. The weekends she spent reviewing data while Daniel attended meetings and accepted congratulations. The moments when he introduced her as my wife, instead of acknowledging her as the person who created the systems that kept Whitmore Dynamics alive. But today was different. Today she was done explaining her value to someone who had already decided not to see it. She closed the box. You're right about one thing, Daniel. His expression softened, expecting an apology. I should stop making this dramatic. She placed her company access card on the table. Because this isn't a fight. The room became even quieter. This is me leaving. Daniel laughed under his breath. Victoria, where exactly do you think you're going? She picked up her coat. Somewhere I'm respected. A few people lowered their heads, pretending to look at their screens. Nobody wanted to admit they had heard the truth. Daniel stood up. You really think you can walk away and everything will be fine? Victoria paused at the door. For a second, the woman who had spent years holding everything together looked back at him. No, Daniel. Her voice was steady. I think everything will finally be honest. Then she walked out. No tears. No shouting. No final argument. Just the sound of her footsteps moving down the hallway. Daniel watched the door close behind her and smiled, convinced he had removed a problem from his company. He turned back toward the executives. All right, he said. Let's get back to work. But less than 10 minutes later, his phone rang. Then another. Then another. His assistant rushed into the room, her face pale. Daniel, we have a problem. He frowned. What happened? She looked at the screen in her hand. The investors are requesting an emergency meeting. Daniel shook his head, still confident. About what? The assistant hesitated. About Victoria Brooks. For the first time that day, Daniel stopped smiling. Because the woman he believed had walked away with nothing had just taken the first step toward changing everything. The next morning, Victoria Brooks woke up earlier than usual. Not because she was afraid of what came next, but because for the first time in years, she was not waking up to solve someone else's problems. She sat quietly at the small kitchen table in her apartment, holding a cup of coffee between her hands and staring out at the city lights fading into the morning sky. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar. For 12 years, her days had started with company emails, investor reports, and messages from Daniel asking for updates before he even said good morning. She had built her life around keeping everything together. The company, the marriage, the image everyone admired. But yesterday, she finally stopped carrying something that was never hers alone. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was her longtime attorney, Marcus Reed. Victoria, I need to ask you something, he said after she answered. Are you absolutely certain about this? Victoria looked down at the notebook sitting beside her coffee. The same notebook she carried during the earliest days of Whitmore Dynamics. Yes, she said. I am. Marcus paused. You understand what happens if you activate those agreements. I do. Daniel will know everything. Victoria took a slow breath. He should have known years ago. Across town. Daniel Whitmore walked into his office, expecting everything to return to normal. His office sat on the top floor of a glass building overlooking downtown Manhattan. The view represented everything he believed he had achieved. Success, power, control. His assistant followed behind him with a tablet in her hands. "The board members are asking questions," she said. Daniel placed his briefcase down. "About what?" "About Victoria leaving." He laughed lightly. "She left. People leave. The company moves forward." His assistant did not smile. "Daniel, they are not asking why she resigned. They are asking why you did not know she had authority over certain company decisions." That made him stop. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, his phone rang. It was one of the investors. Daniel picked up immediately. "Good morning. I assume this is about the meeting request." The investor's voice was calm but serious. "Daniel, we need clarification regarding Victoria Brooks." He leaned back in his chair. "She was an employee." There was a pause. "That is not how our records describe her." Daniel's expression changed. "Excuse me. We will discuss this during the emergency meeting." The call ended. For the first time, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. Meanwhile, Victoria met Marcus at a quiet office downtown. He placed a folder on the table between them. "I want you to remember something," Marcus said. "You are not doing this because you want revenge." Victoria looked at the folder but did not open it yet. "I know. You are doing this because you spent years allowing someone else to tell your story." She nodded slowly. Inside the folder were documents she had protected for years. Agreements, ownership records, proof of the work she had done before anyone knew Daniel Whitmore's name. She was not taking something away from him. She was simply stopping him from pretending she never existed. Back at Whitmore Dynamics, Daniel entered the emergency board meeting confident that he could explain everything. But as the doors closed behind him, he noticed something unusual. Nobody looked angry. Nobody looked confused. They looked concerned. And sitting at the center of the table was a document with one name printed across the top. Victoria Brooks. Daniel stared at it, unaware that the woman he thought had disappeared had just become the most important person in the room. Daniel Whitmore had spent years walking into rooms expecting everyone to listen. Investors waited for his presentation. Employees followed his instructions. Reporters wrote about his vision. He had built an identity around being the man who always knew what came next. But sitting at the center of the emergency board meeting, with Victoria Brooks's name printed on the document in front of him, Daniel felt something he hated admitting. He did not know what was happening. He opened the folder and looked through the first page. His eyes moved quickly over the words, searching for something he could dismiss. Then he stopped. "This cannot be right," he said. Across the table, several board members remained silent. Daniel looked up. "She was my wife. She worked with the company, yes, but she was never in control of these decisions." One of the board members, Richard Collins, calmly adjusted his glasses. "Daniel, that is exactly the problem. You believed her role was personal. The records show it was professional." Daniel leaned forward. "Are you telling me Victoria had authority over company operations?" Richard looked at him. "I am telling you that Victoria Brooks was one of the reasons this company became what it is today." The room became quiet. Daniel looked around, expecting someone to disagree. Nobody did. For the first time, he realized something uncomfortable. The people around him knew more about Victoria than he did. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in Marcus Reed's office reviewing the same documents she had avoided opening for years. She ran her fingers over the pages slowly. These papers represented a part of herself she had hidden away. Not because she was weak, because she had wanted to believe her marriage was built on trust. "You could have revealed this years ago," Marcus said gently. Victoria nodded. "I could have. Why did you not?" She looked out the window. "Because I loved him." The answer was simple, and somehow, that made it heavier. She remembered Daniel before the company became famous, before the expensive suits and magazine interviews. Back then, he was just a man with an idea and a lot of determination. She believed in him. She believed in what they were building together. But somewhere along the way, Daniel stopped seeing a partner beside him and started seeing someone standing behind him. Back in the boardroom, Daniel continued fighting. "This is a misunderstanding. Victoria never wanted responsibility like this." Another board member spoke. "Did you ever ask her?" Daniel stayed silent. That question bothered him more than any accusation. Because the truth was, he never really asked. He assumed. He assumed she was comfortable in the background. He assumed her silence meant she had nothing to say. He assumed leaving would hurt her more than him. His phone suddenly vibrated. A message from his assistant appeared. Several investors are requesting updated information about company ownership and operational structure. Daniel stared at the screen. The confidence he carried into the room started disappearing. He looked back at the documents. The woman he had called replaceable was connected to decisions worth billions of dollars. The woman he thought walked away empty-handed had simply stopped giving him access to everything she built. That evening, Victoria returned home and placed the documents back in their folder. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply sat quietly, knowing tomorrow would bring more questions, more pressure, more attention. But she also knew one thing. For the first time in years, her future belonged to her. And Daniel Whitmore was finally about to discover what happens when someone underestimates the person who helped build everything he was afraid to lose. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, the story inside Whitmore Dynamics had already changed. The employees who once whispered about Daniel Whitmore's leadership were now quietly asking a different question. How much of the company had actually been built by Victoria Brooks? Daniel arrived at the office early, hoping to regain control before rumors spread further. He walked through the lobby with the same confidence he had always carried. But this time, the conversation stopped when he entered. People looked at him differently, not with admiration, with uncertainty. Inside his office, his assistant placed a stack of reports on his desk. "These came in overnight," she said. Daniel glanced at the pages. "What am I looking at?" "Requests from investors. They want confirmation of the company structure, intellectual property records, and decision-making authority." Daniel leaned back. "They are overreacting." His assistant hesitated. "Daniel, they are asking because they believe something was hidden." That sentence bothered him more than anything else. Hidden. He had spent years believing Victoria was the person who needed him. Now the company he controlled was questioning him because of her. Meanwhile, Victoria sat across from Marcus Reed, reviewing the next steps. She looked calm, but Marcus noticed the exhaustion behind her eyes. "You know this will become public soon," he said. Victoria nodded. "I know. People will ask why you stayed quiet for so long." Victoria looked down at the table. "Because I was not trying to destroy him." Marcus studied her expression. Even after everything he said yesterday? She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "Daniel hurt me. But I do not want to become someone who only knows how to hurt back." That was the difference between them. Daniel wanted control. Victoria wanted the truth. Later that afternoon, the board meeting continued. Daniel entered the room prepared with explanations. He had spent the morning calling advisors, trying to understand how the situation had changed so quickly. "I think everyone needs to slow down," Daniel said. "Victoria was involved, but this company has always operated under my leadership." Richard Collins opened a folder. "Daniel, leadership is not about who receives the most attention. It is about recognizing the people who create value." Daniel frowned. "Are you saying I did not build this company?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Richard said, "We are saying you forgot who helped you build it." The words hit harder than Daniel expected, because somewhere deep down, he knew there was truth in them. He remembered the early years, the tiny office, the late nights, the first major contract. Victoria sitting beside him with spreadsheets and plans while he practiced presentations. Back then, he always told people they were a team. But success changed the way he saw things. Slowly, he started saying "my company" instead of "our company." That small change had become something much bigger. That evening, a financial report reached Daniel's desk. Several major partners had requested meetings with Victoria directly. They were not abandoning the company. They were questioning his leadership. Daniel stared at the report for several minutes. The woman he had dismissed as someone who would struggle without him was now the person everyone wanted to hear from. He picked up his phone and opened Victoria's contact. His finger hovered over the call button. For years, she had always answered. She had always been there. But this time, Daniel stopped. Because for the first time, he wondered if she would choose not to pick up. And that thought frightened him more than losing any business deal. Victoria Brooks spent the next few days doing something Daniel Whitmore never expected. Nothing. She did not appear on television. She did not release a statement. She did not celebrate as the company she helped build began questioning his decisions. She simply continued her life, one careful step at a time. For years, Daniel had mistaken her silence for weakness. He never understood that sometimes silence was not surrender. Sometimes it was someone choosing the right moment to speak. Inside Marcus Reed's office, Victoria reviewed the final documents that would officially separate her from the company structure she had helped create. Marcus placed the papers in front of her. "Once you sign these, there is no going back," he said. Victoria looked at the pages. "I know. The media may get involved. Investors may ask questions. Daniel may try to control the story." She gave a small nod. "He always does." Marcus studied her carefully. "Are you ready for everyone to know the truth?" Victoria was quiet for a moment. The truth sounded simple, but she knew it would change everything. People would not just learn about business agreements or ownership records. They would learn about the years she spent behind the scenes. The years she smiled while watching someone else receive credit for her work. "I am not doing this because I want people to admire me," Victoria said. "I just do not want anyone else to believe I was invisible." Meanwhile, Daniel was facing a problem he could not solve with confidence alone. His advisors had spent days trying to find a way forward, but every conversation led back to the same issue. Victoria. He sat in his office looking at old company records when his assistant walked in. "Daniel, there is someone here to see you." He looked up. "Who?" "Victoria." For a moment, he said nothing. He had imagined this moment many times. He thought she would come back angry. He thought she would demand an apology. He thought she would need something from him. But when Victoria walked into the office, she was calm. Completely calm. "You came," Daniel said. She looked around the room. The same office where he had once told her she was not important enough to stand beside him. "I came because we need to have a conversation." Daniel stood up. "Victoria, I think things have gotten out of control." She looked at him. "No, Daniel. Things are finally under control." His expression changed. "You are really going to do this?" Victoria took a breath. "Do what?" "Take everything away from me." She shook her head. "You still do not understand." She placed a folder on his desk. "I am not taking your company. I am protecting the work that was always mine too." Daniel opened the folder but did not look through it immediately. "Why now?" he asked. Victoria looked toward the window. "Because yesterday, you looked at me and told me I had nothing without you." Her voice remained steady, and I realized you truly believed it. For the first time, Daniel had no response. The woman standing in front of him was not the same woman who used to apologize just to keep peace. She was someone who had finally accepted her own value. As Victoria walked toward the door, Daniel called after her. "Victoria." She stopped. "Do you really think you can walk away from all of this?" She turned slightly. "I already did." After she left, Daniel opened the folder. The first page contained a document that changed the entire situation. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was something much more powerful. Proof. And as Daniel continued reading, he realized the person he underestimated the most had been protecting him for years. Now she was protecting herself. Daniel Whitmore stayed in his office long after everyone else had left the building. The city lights outside his window looked the same as they always had, but somehow everything felt different. For years, this view represented success, power, control. Now, it felt like a reminder of everything he had failed to notice. The folder Victoria left behind was still sitting on his desk. He had opened it several times, but every time he reached the same pages, he stopped. Not because he did not understand the documents, because he understood them too well. The agreements, the ownership records, the original development files. They all told a story he had spent years ignoring. Victoria was not just the person who supported his dream. She was one of the people who created it. His phone rang. It was his business advisor, Thomas Grant. "Daniel, we need to talk." Daniel looked at the documents in front of him. "About Victoria?" "About the company." Thomas paused. "Several partners are reconsidering their positions." Daniel stood up. "Because she left?" "No. Because they are realizing how much depended on her." That answer irritated him. She was never the public face of this company. Thomas sighed. "Daniel, that was the mistake. You thought the person in front of the cameras was the person holding everything together." The call ended, leaving Daniel alone with a truth he did not want to accept. Meanwhile, Victoria was not celebrating. She was sitting in her apartment, looking through old photographs from the early years of Whitmore Dynamics. In one picture, she and Daniel were standing in a small office with empty walls and cheap furniture. They were younger, hopeful. They believed they were building something together. She remembered Daniel saying, "One day, people will know what we created." Back then, she believed he meant both of them. She never imagined that one day he would forget. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "The board has scheduled another meeting," he said. "They want you there." Victoria was quiet. "Do they want answers?" "They want leadership." She looked down at the photograph in her hand. "I never wanted his position." Marcus replied, "That is exactly why people trust you." The next morning, the boardroom was filled before Victoria arrived. This time, the atmosphere was different. Nobody was waiting to hear Daniel explain the future. They were waiting for Victoria to speak. When she entered, the room became silent. Daniel was already there. He looked tired, not defeated, but uncertain. Victoria took her seat across from him. Richard Collins opened the meeting. "We are here to discuss the future direction of Whitmore Dynamics." Daniel quickly interrupted. "Before we make any decisions, I think everyone needs to remember who built this company." Victoria looked at him calmly. "That is exactly what everyone is trying to remember." The room went quiet. Daniel looked away. Richard placed a report on the table. "The company is facing serious instability. Several partners are concerned about trust, structure, and transparency." Daniel looked frustrated. "So what are you suggesting?" Richard answered carefully. "We are suggesting that the company needs someone who understands what made it successful in the first place." Everyone knew what he meant. Victoria did not smile. She did not look proud. She simply listened. Because this was never about watching Daniel fall. It was about finally standing where she always belonged. As the meeting continued, another message appeared on the screen in front of the board members. A major investor requested a private conversation with Victoria Brooks. Daniel noticed the message, and for the first time, he realized something that frightened him. The world was no longer asking what Daniel Whitmore wanted. It was asking what Victoria Brooks would do next. The investor meeting was supposed to last 30 minutes. It lasted nearly 2 hours. For Daniel Whitmore, every minute felt like another reminder that the world he controlled was slowly moving beyond his reach. He sat at the end of the conference table, listening as investors asked questions they had never asked before. Not about growth numbers, not about expansion plans, about trust, about leadership, about the people who had been overlooked. Victoria Brooks sat quietly across the room, taking notes. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She simply listened. And somehow, that made Daniel more uncomfortable than anger ever could have. One investor leaned forward. "Victoria, we reviewed the early company records. Your involvement was far greater than anyone publicly understood." Victoria nodded. "I was involved. More than involved," the investor replied. "You designed the foundation that allowed this company to scale." Daniel shifted in his chair. "I think we are making this more complicated than it needs to be." Everyone looked at him. He continued, "Victoria helped. I appreciate that. But companies need leaders who can make decisions." Victoria finally looked at him. "You are right about that." Daniel seemed surprised. "I am. Yes. Companies need leaders who can make decisions. But they also need leaders who know when to listen." The room became silent. It was not an attack. It was simply the truth. After the meeting ended, Victoria stayed behind with Marcus and a few board members. Daniel left first. For the first time in years, he walked out of a room without everyone following him. Outside the building, reporters had already started asking questions. They wanted to know why investors were suddenly meeting with Victoria Brooks. They wanted to know if there was a leadership change coming. Daniel ignored them and walked toward his car. But the questions followed him. At the same time, Victoria returned to her apartment and found a package waiting at her door. Inside was an old notebook. The first business plan she and Daniel created together 12 years earlier. She opened it slowly. On the first page were two names written side by side: Victoria Brooks and Daniel Whitmore. For a moment, she remembered the man Daniel used to be. The man who listened. The man who believed they were partners. She wondered when everything changed. Not when the company became successful. Not when the money arrived. It happened slowly. Every time he took credit without mentioning the people beside him. Every time he made a decision without asking. Every time he treated kindness as something permanent instead of something valuable. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. "The board is ready to make a recommendation," he said. Victoria sat down. "Already. They believe the company needs a transition plan." She closed the notebook. "And Daniel?" Marcus paused. "He knows it is coming." Across town, Daniel stood alone in his office, looking at the same city view that once made him feel untouchable. His assistant placed a letter on his desk. This came from the board. He opened it carefully. His eyes moved across the page. The words were professional, respectful, but the meaning was clear. They were preparing for a change. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to blame Victoria. But deep down, he knew the hardest part was not losing control of the company. It was realizing that he had spent years pushing away the one person who truly understood how to protect it. And now, that person was the only one everyone trusted to save what he built. The morning of the board decision arrived quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no angry arguments, no public confrontation, just a simple meeting invitation sent to every executive at Whitmore Dynamics. But everyone who received it understood what it meant. Daniel Whitmore arrived at the headquarters before anyone else. He walked through the same lobby he had entered hundreds of times, but something felt different. The employees who once rushed to greet him now simply nodded politely. The admiration was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Inside the boardroom, Daniel took his usual seat at the head of the table. For a moment, he looked like the same confident CEO everyone knew. But the silence around him told a different story. Richard Collins opened the meeting. Today, we are discussing the future leadership structure of Whitmore Dynamics. Daniel folded his hands. I assume everyone understands that changing leadership during a difficult period creates more instability. Richard looked at him calmly. The instability did not begin when Victoria left. Daniel's expression tightened. Then when did it begin? Richard answered. When the company became dependent on one person's image instead of the strength of the people behind it. Nobody spoke after that, because everyone knew exactly what he meant. Victoria sat quietly near the end of the table. She did not look at Daniel with anger. She did not look satisfied. She looked like someone who had finally accepted a truth she had avoided for years. A board member placed a document in front of Daniel. The recommendation is to appoint an interim leadership team while the company restructures. Daniel read the page carefully. He understood every word before he reached the bottom. They were removing his control, not because he had failed at everything, not because the company was worthless, but because he had forgotten what made it valuable. He looked across the table at Victoria. Was this what you wanted? The room became still. Victoria took a moment before answering. No, Daniel looked surprised. No, I wanted you to remember that you never built this alone. Her voice was calm. I wanted you to understand that the people beside you mattered. Daniel looked down. For the first time, he had no argument. After the meeting, Victoria stepped outside the building. She expected to feel something. Relief. Satisfaction. Something that proved all the pain had been worth it. But she only felt quiet. Because winning was not as simple as she once imagined. She had not spent years hoping to see Daniel lose. She had spent years hoping he would finally see her. Later that afternoon, Daniel remained in his office packing a few personal items. A photo from the early company days sat on his desk. He picked it up and stared at it. In the picture, he and Victoria were standing in that small rented office where everything started. They were smiling because they believed they were building something together. His phone rang. It was Victoria. Daniel hesitated before answering. Hello. There was a pause. I wanted to check on you, she said. The simple kindness surprised him. After everything? Daniel asked quietly. Victoria sighed. I am not calling because I forgot what happened. She looked out at the city from her apartment window. I am calling because I remember who we were before we lost ourselves. Daniel closed his eyes. For years, he thought power came from making people need him. Now he was learning something different. The people who truly matter are not the ones you control. They are the ones who stay when they do not have to. And Victoria had already proven she no longer needed to stay. 6 months later, Whitmore Dynamics looked different. The glass building was the same. The city outside still moved at the same impossible speed. But inside the company, something had changed. People listened more. Teams worked together more. Decisions were no longer made by one voice in a room full of people afraid to disagree. Victoria Brooks never wanted a celebration. She never wanted her name on a giant sign or a headline about how she defeated Daniel Whitmore. She simply wanted the company to remember what it was built on. Trust, respect, and people who believed in something bigger than themselves. One afternoon, Victoria stood in the same small conference room where everything had started years earlier. The room was being renovated, but she asked the team to keep one thing exactly the same. The old wooden table where she and Daniel created their first plans. Marcus Reed walked in and smiled. I still cannot believe you kept this table. Victoria looked at it and smiled softly. It reminds me of something important. "What is that?" he asked. She ran her hand across the surface. "Success is not about forgetting where you started." Across town, Daniel was living a much quieter life. He no longer had the corner office. He no longer had people waiting outside his door for every decision. At first, the silence bothered him. He was used to being needed. He was used to feeling important. But slowly, he started seeing things differently. He began working with smaller businesses, helping young entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes he had made. Not because he wanted attention, because he finally understood the value of humility. One evening, Daniel and Victoria met for coffee. It was not a romantic meeting. It was not a reunion. It was two people who shared a long history finally speaking honestly. Daniel looked across the table. "I owe you an apology." Victoria listened quietly. "I spent years believing I was the reason everything succeeded," he continued. "I forgot that success was never created by one person." Victoria nodded. "That realization matters." Daniel looked down at his coffee. "I wish I had understood sooner." She gave a small smile. "So do I." There was no anger in her voice. Only acceptance. Because sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is accepting that some people will never give you the apology you deserved at the time you needed it. Victoria had learned that her peace could not depend on Daniel finally understanding her. She had to choose herself first. Years earlier, she had walked away from a room where people believed she had nothing. She walked away without shouting, without proving anything, without needing everyone to believe her immediately. And that was the moment everything began to change. Because the truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by someone who finally knows their own worth. Daniel once believed losing Victoria meant losing an employee, a partner, someone replaceable. But the lesson he learned was much bigger. The people we underestimate are often the people holding everything together. And the respect we fail to give today can become the thing we wish we had tomorrow. Victoria continued building her future, not because she wanted revenge, but because she finally understood something she had forgotten for years. Her value was never created by someone else recognizing it. It was always there. She just had to stop waiting for permission to see it herself.